"This ring, where did you get it?" Grace's voice cracked as her gaze locked on the brilliant emerald glinting on the man's finger. He lifted his head slowly, his face weathered and hollow, but his eyes, they held something she couldn't place. Something that stopped her cold. "It's mine," he rasped, his voice gravelly, like it hadn't been used in years. His fingers curled around the ring as though shielding it. "The only thing I have left." Grace's heart pounded as her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. That ring, the gold band with its flawless emerald centerpiece, wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was her father's ring. The one he wore every day of his life until he vanished more than 20 years ago. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her voice trembling. "That's impossible. My father, he died?" the man said, his lips twisting into a bitter smile. "Lo, gracie. He didn't die." He straightened slightly, his frail frame trembling as if under the weight of his words. "He's right here." Her knees nearly buckled as his voice cut through her like a blade. It wasn't just familiar, it was unmistakable. "Dad?" she stammered, the word escaping her lips in a whisper. The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his tattered coat and pulled out a crumpled envelope, holding it out to her with a trembling hand. Grace stared at the envelope, her breath catching in her throat. Her hand shook as she took it. The paper was yellowed and stained, but the name scrawled on the front sent a shiver down her spine. "To Daddy." Her chest tightened. She knew this envelope. She'd written it the night before her last school play, the day her father disappeared. She'd left it on the kitchen table for him to find, excited for the surprise she'd planned. How do you have this?" Her voice cracked as she gripped the envelope, holding it as though it might vanish. The man, her father, lowered his gaze, his face a mask of sorrow. "It's a long story, Grace," he said quietly, his voice thick with regret. "And you're not ready to hear it. You can't just show up like this," she said, her voice rising. "Not after all this time. If you're really my father, then you owe me an explanation." His eyes flicked around the dimly lit street, and his posture stiffened. "This isn't the place," he muttered, his voice low and urgent. "It's not safe here." "Safe?" Grace snapped. "Safe from what?" He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. "The people I trusted," he said bitterly. "They used me, and when I realized what they were doing, it was too late. I tried to get out, but if I stayed, they would have come for you and your mother. I couldn't let that happen." Grace's mind reeled. "So you just left? You think that protected us?" "I didn't have a choice," he said softly. "They would have destroyed everything I loved." Before she could respond, something caught her eye. At the far end of the street, a black car had pulled to a stop. Two men in dark coats stepped out, their faces obscured by shadows. Her father stiffened, his body rigid with tension. "It's them," he whispered, his voice filled with dread. "You need to leave. Now." "Leave," Grace said, her voice rising in disbelief. "I'm not leaving you." "Don't," he snapped, grabbing her arm. "If they see you with me, they'll come after you too." His grip was firm, almost desperate, and for the first time, she saw real fear in his eyes. It wasn't for himself, it was for her. "Please, Grace," he said, his voice breaking. "Just go." Tears stung her eyes as she wrenched her arm free. She wanted to fight, to stay, but the urgency in his voice left her no choice. She turned and walked away, her steps heavy, her chest tight with emotion. When she reached the corner, she glanced back. The men were walking toward the bench where her father sat, their movements deliberate and menacing. Grace's heart ached as she watched him lower his head, his shoulders slumping in defeat. She wanted to run back, to pull him away, but she forced herself to keep walking. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, fears, and anger. The man she had idolized as a child, the man she thought she'd lost forever, was here, but he was a stranger now. A stranger hiding from a past that had swallowed him whole. She didn't know what to believe, but one thing was certain, she wasn't giving up. Whatever secrets her father was hiding, she would uncover them, and whoever was hunting him, they would have to deal with her, too. Grace couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of her father's gaunt face and haunted eyes flashed before her. She sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by old photographs she'd dug out of storage. In each one, her father was smiling, confident, strong, and full of life. The man she had seen yesterday bore no resemblance to the man in these pictures. He looked like a shadow of himself, hollowed out by years of fear and regret. How could this happen to him? She whispered to herself. By dawn, her frustration had boiled over into determination. She needed answers, and she wasn't going to let him push her away again. She found him in the same place, hunched over on the bench. He looked even more frail in the pale morning light, his hands trembling as he fidgeted with the ring on his finger. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice firm. "If someone's threatening us, I need to know who they are." He flinched at her tone but didn't look up. Instead, he let out a shaky sigh, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. "I worked with people who called themselves friends," he began, his voice rough and uneven. "They made promises, wealth, security. It sounded so simple back then. All I had to do was keep my mouth shut." Grace frowned. "Keep your mouth shut about what?" His jaw tightened, and his hands balled into fists on his lap. "They were laundering money, Grace. Millions of dollars, funneled through fake companies, bribes, and offshore accounts. At first, I didn't understand what I was involved in, but by the time I did," he shook his head. "It was too late." Her stomach churned as the weight of his confession sank in. "Why didn't you just leave?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger. "Why didn't you come to us?" "I tried," he said, his voice breaking, "but they found out. They told me that if I walked away or went to the police, you and your mother would pay the price." He looked up at her then, his eyes filled with pain. "I couldn't risk your lives, Grace. So I did the only thing I could. I disappeared." His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Grace's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You could have trusted us," she said, her voice sharp. "We could have figured something out together." "No, Grace," he said firmly. "You don't understand what these people are capable of. They have money, power, influence. They don't leave loose ends." Before she could respond, something caught her attention out of the corner of her eye. A black car had pulled up at the far end of the street. Two men in dark coats stepped out, their movements deliberate and calculated. "Is that them?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her father's face paled as his eyes darted toward the men. "Go home, Grace," he said urgently, rising to his feet. "Forget we talked." "No," she said, standing her ground. "I'm not leaving you like this. You have to," he insisted, his voice rising. "If they see you with me, they'll come after you too." The desperation in his voice sent chills down her spine. Reluctantly, she turned and walked away, but as she rounded the corner, she couldn't resist glancing back. The two men were standing by the bench now, towering over her father as he slumped back down. Her chest tightened. She wanted to run back, to pull him away, but she forced herself to keep walking. Grace spent the rest of the day trying to calm her nerves, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. Who were these men? How far would they go to keep their secrets? And how could she protect her father if he refused to let her help? She needed answers, and she knew she couldn't get them on her own. That evening, she called Alex, an old friend who worked as a private investigator. "Grace." Alex sounded surprised. "It's been years. What's going on?" "I need your help," she said, her voice trembling. "It's about my father." They met at a small diner on the outskirts of the city. Grace explained everything. Her father's disappearance, his sudden reappearance, and the men who were now watching him. Alex listened intently, his expression growing darker with each word. "This sounds serious," he said when she finished. "If what your dad's saying is true, these people won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens them." "I need to know who they are," Grace said, her voice firm. "And I need to know how to stop them." Alex nodded. "I'll see what I can dig up. But Grace, be careful. These kinds of people don't play by the rules." Over the next few days, Grace tried to keep a low profile. She avoided going back to the bench, afraid that she might draw attention to herself or her father. But the tension was unbearable. Every time she stepped outside, she felt like someone was watching her. Alex called her late one night. "I found something," he said, his tone grave. "Your father wasn't exaggerating. The people he worked for, they're part of a criminal organization that's been under investigation for years. Money laundering, racketeering, even ties to violent crimes." Grace's blood ran cold. "Do they know about me?" "I don't think so," Alex said. "Not yet. But you need to be careful, Grace. If they find out you're digging into this, you'll become a target too." She hung up the phone, her mind racing. The more she learned, the more dangerous this situation became. But she couldn't back down now, not when her father's life was on the line. A few days later, Grace spotted the black car again. It was parked across the street from her apartment, its windows tinted so dark she couldn't see inside. Her heart pounded as she closed the curtains, trying to steady her breathing. Were they watching her now? Or was this just a coincidence? She picked up her phone and called her father. He answered on the third ring, his voice shaky. "Grace," he said, "you shouldn't be calling me. There's a car outside my apartment," she said, her voice trembling. "A black car. Is it them?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with dread. "Don't leave your apartment," he said. "Lock the doors. Don't talk to anyone." "Dad, I'm scared," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I'll handle it," he said. "Just stay safe." That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She paced her apartment, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. She didn't know who these people were or what they wanted, but one thing was clear: they weren't going to stop until her father was silenced. The next morning, she received a message from Alex. "I found something big," it read. "Meet me tonight. Usual place." Grace's stomach churned as she stared at the message. Whatever Alex had uncovered, it could be the key to exposing the people who were hunting her father, but it could also put them both in danger. She took a deep breath and typed her reply, "I'll be there." As the hours ticked by, her anxiety grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Every shadow seemed to move. Every stranger seemed to be watching her. When night fell, she grabbed her coat and headed out, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. She didn't know what Alex had found, but she was ready to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. Grace knew hesitation wasn't an option anymore. She had to act, and Alex was the only person she trusted to help her. Meeting him in a secluded cafe on the outskirts of town, she wasted no time laying out the situation. "I need everything you can find on the people my father worked for," she said, sliding an envelope of cash across the table. "I don't care how dangerous it is." Alex studied her for a long moment, his expression grim. "This isn't just dangerous, Grace. These people don't leave witnesses." "But if you're sure." "I am," she said firmly. He nodded. "Give me a few days." 3 tense days later, Alex called her back. They met in the same cafe, but this time his demeanor was even more serious. He placed a thick folder on the table between them, his hand lingering on it as though reluctant to let it go. "What I found," he started, lowering his voice. "It's bad, Grace. Really bad." She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages. There were documents detailing offshore accounts, fraudulent transactions, and a list of names, some of which she recognized as powerful figures in business and politics. "Your father wasn't lying," Alex said, leaning closer. "He worked for a syndicate that launders money on a massive scale. When he tried to leave, they marked him for elimination. The only reason he's alive is that something went wrong. Either he disappeared before they could find him, or someone higher up decided he was more useful alive than dead." Grace's hands trembled as she flipped through the papers. "These names," she said, "are these the people in charge?" Alex nodded. "Some of them, yes. But this isn't the full list. They're careful. Most of the real players operate through intermediaries. Even if we go to the authorities, we'll need more than this to bring them down." She clenched her jaw. "Then we'll find more." That night, Grace confronted her father. He was sitting on the edge of the park bench, staring into the distance as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. "You lied to me," she said, standing in front of him and holding up the folder. "You said you left to protect us. But you were running from this." He flinched at the sight of the papers. "Where did you get that?" "It doesn't matter," she snapped. "What matters is that you've been hiding this from me, from us, all these years. I thought you were a victim, but you were part of it." "I was," he admitted, his voice heavy with shame, "but I didn't know what I was getting into. And when I realized—" "You ran," she interrupted, her tone cold. "You left us to pick up the pieces while you disappeared into the shadows." He stood, his eyes blazing with frustration. "What else could I have done, Grace? Gone to the police? You think they would have protected us? These people own the system. They own everything." She held his gaze, refusing to back down. "We still have to fight them. If we don't, they'll keep destroying lives." He shook his head. "You don't understand. If they find out you're involved." "I'm already involved," she said, her voice firm. "And I'm not going to sit by while they hunt you down." Their argument was cut short by the sound of tires screeching to a halt. Grace turned to see the black car she'd been dreading, its sleek silhouette ominous under the streetlights. "Grace, get out of here," her father said, his voice low and urgent. "No," she said, stepping closer to him. "I'm not leaving you." The car doors opened, and 2 men stepped out, their dark coats billowing in the wind. They moved with purpose, their faces hidden in shadow. "Grace," her father said, grabbing her arm. "Run. Now." She hesitated, her mind racing. But when she saw the cold glint of metal in one of the men's hands, she knew she had no choice. "Go!" her father shouted, pushing her away. She turned and ran, her heart pounding as she ducked into an alley. She didn't stop until she reached the main road, blending into the crowd of pedestrians. From the safety of the crowd, she looked back. Her father was still standing by the bench, his shoulders squared as the men approached him. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but the tension in the air was palpable. The next morning, Alex called her with an update. "I've got a lead," he said. "There's a warehouse on the outskirts of the city that the syndicate uses for their operations. If we can get inside, we might find the evidence we need to take them down." Grace hesitated. "How dangerous is this?" "Very," he admitted, "but it's our best shot." That night, Grace and Alex drove to the warehouse. The building loomed in the darkness, its windows covered with grime, and its exterior guarded by high fences. Alex handed her a small recording device. "Stick close to me," he said. "If anything goes wrong, we get out immediately." They crept through the shadows, slipping past the guards and into the building. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and damp concrete. They moved quickly, searching for anything that could link the syndicate to the crimes her father had described. In a back office, Alex found a safe hidden behind a false panel in the wall. He worked quickly, cracking the combination and pulling out a stack of files. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace flipped through the documents, her heart racing. They were contracts, bank statements, and correspondence, enough to implicate several high-ranking members of the syndicate. But as they turned to leave, they heard voices in the hallway. "Someone's here," a man said. Grace's blood ran cold. "Quick," Alex whispered, pulling her into a storage closet. They crouched in the darkness, holding their breath as footsteps echoed outside. The door creaked open, and a beam of light swept across the room. Grace's pulse thundered in her ears as she pressed herself against the wall, praying they wouldn't be found. After a tense moment, the door closed, and the footsteps faded. "Let's go," Alex whispered. They slipped out of the building and back to the car, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "We did it," Alex said as they drove away. This could bring them down, but Grace couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The syndicate wouldn't let them walk away unscathed, and she knew deep down that the real danger was still to come. Grace and her father stood at the park's edge, their breath visible in the cold night air. She could feel the weight of everything closing in, the secrets, the lies, the danger. Her father's face was pale, but his expression was set with grim determination. "They won't stop, Grace," he said, his voice low but steady. "If you stay, they'll come for you too." "They already have," she shot back. "I'm not running." Before he could respond, the sound of tires screeching shattered the tense silence. Both of them turned toward the street, where a black car came to an abrupt halt. The doors flew open, and two men stepped out, their movements swift and deliberate. One of them drew a gun and aimed it directly at her father. "We told you to stay out of this," the man barked. His voice was sharp, his hand steady. Grace's heart pounded as she instinctively stepped in front of her father, shielding him with her body. "This isn't right," she yelled, her voice trembling but loud. "You can't hide the truth forever." Her father grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back, but she stood firm. "Grace, move," he hissed, desperation in his voice. The man with the gun hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. "We don't need her," the second man said coldly. "Take him out." Time seemed to slow as Grace saw the gunman's finger tighten on the trigger. Before she could react, the shot rang out, piercing the stillness of the night. Her father staggered, clutching his side as blood began to seep through his fingers. "No!" Grace screamed, catching him as he collapsed to the ground. She pressed her hands against the wound, her own blood running cold. "Dad, stay with me." The two men froze at the sound of approaching sirens. They exchanged a brief glance before retreating to the car. Within seconds, the vehicle roared away, its taillights disappearing into the distance. Grace sat in the hospital waiting room, her hands stained with her father's blood. The minutes stretched into hours as she replayed the scene over and over in her mind. The look on her father's face, the sound of the gunshot, the warmth of his blood on her hands. It was all seared into her memory. When the doctor finally emerged, her heart leapt to her throat. "He's stable," the doctor said. "The bullet missed his vital organs. He'll recover, but he'll need time." Relief flooded through her, but it was short-lived. The danger wasn't over, and she knew it. The next day, Alex met her at the hospital with an update. They messed up, he said, handing her a folder. The evidence we got from the warehouse, combined with what just happened, has sparked police interest. They're opening an investigation into the syndicate. Grace flipped through the documents, her resolve hardening. It's not enough, she said. These people have been untouchable for years. We need something bigger, something that guarantees they won't walk away from this. Alex nodded. There's one more thing we can do, he said, but it's risky. That evening, Grace visited her father's hospital room. He was pale but awake, his eyes heavy with guilt as she approached. You shouldn't be here, he said weakly. It's not safe. Neither is doing nothing, she replied. He sighed, his shoulders slumping against the pillows. Grace, I've already failed you once. Don't let me fail you again. She shook her head. You didn't fail me, Dad. You did what you thought was right. But now it's my turn to protect you. His eyes glistened with unshed tears. I don't deserve this second chance. We don't always get what we deserve, she said, squeezing his hand. But we do get to choose what we do with it. Over the next few days, Grace, Alex, and her father worked with the police, providing evidence that exposed the syndicate. Within days, high-ranking members were arrested, their carefully constructed empire crumbling under the weight of the investigation. 2 weeks later, Grace stood outside the hospital, watching as her father was escorted into a secure vehicle by federal agents. He was being placed under witness protection, his only chance at survival. I'll miss you, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. He pulled her into a tight embrace. You gave me a second chance, Grace. Now it's time for you to live yours. Tears burned her eyes as she stepped back, watching the car drive away. She knew it was the right thing to do, but the ache in her chest was undeniable. As the car disappeared into the distance, she took a deep breath and turned to Alex, who stood beside her. What now? He asked. Grace wiped her tears and squared her shoulders. Now we rebuild.